Thanks to the Anti-Corporatist for suggesting this one. The concept is this. We have too much carbon. It's causing global warming. Too much carbon in the atmosphere, yada, yada, causing global warming. How are we actually going to solve the problem? Yes, I understand. There's all sorts of legislative things to do. But when it comes down to actually fixing things, which is the phase we are in now, where we can't just stop harming, but now we must take steps to actively fix. The question is, how do we do it? I don't necessarily agree with what we're about to watch, but I'll tell you this, I agree with the spirit behind it. We should be taking big swings, and we should be investing in the process of figuring out what we're going to do. Here is, let me make sure I'm reading this channel correctly. Here is 2-Bit Da Vinci, as recommended by the Anti-Corporatist, telling the story of somebody who tried.
Pouring rust into the oceans as fertilizer could be the answer to reaching carbon neutrality on a global scale. That's right, I know that sounds crazy, but there is a plan to suck out excess carbon from the atmosphere by growing phytoplankton using rust as a fertilizer. Now, this idea has been around for as long as 30 years, but it has always been marred in controversy with the danger of even worse carbon emissions from the formation of dead zones in the ocean. But could this plan actually work? And if so, would the benefits outweigh any possible unintended consequences? So there's some pretty amazing parts to this story that you're not going to want to miss. So stay tuned till the end and let's find out. I'm Ricky, and this is 2-Bit Da Vinci.
Now I have to tell you, when I first watched this in the first moments, I already had a strong thought right there. When he says, "Oh, but there's a lot of controversy," I go, I have never heard of the bad guys raising a stink about something unless it interferes with their profit. So if there's controversy, I'm assuming just based on that the people that have a problem with it have a damn good reason to have a problem with it. Bear in mind that gigantic grain of salt as we watch, as they talk about what this concept actually is. Here it is. First, just understand what is being pitched to us.
This video is brought to you by Delete Me. You see, the last idea, sinking algae as a form of carbon capture, was all about taking a reactive approach that would help manage and take advantage of massive algae blooms like the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt, aka the giant seaweed blob. But some researchers and business people are now proposing to take more proactive approaches to hit on the same goals by intentionally triggering photosynthetic phytoplankton blooms. The idea is to use iron rust as fertilizer to feed phytoplankton and help it grow, absorbing carbon from the atmosphere and then sequestering it as the dead phytoplankton cells and high carbon animal exertions from the animals that eat it at the bottom of the ocean. This would have the added benefit of providing a rich source of food and nutrients for the rest of the ocean's food chain, bringing life and fishing back to where we've been depleting it by overfishing and polluting it for years. Such a simple and elegant solution, right? Well, this actually has many scientists and ecologists in an uproar, pinning this idea as a form of geoengineering, a term that seems innocuous but is kind of at the root of all evil for some people. A crazy experiment that could go horribly wrong and end up doing much more harm than good, affecting everyone on the planet. If it succeeds though, it could be the single most important carbon capture solution at global scale, one that would cost as little as $2 per ton of captured carbon, making it the cheapest option available in history. But the problem is that it would also end up triggering even worse greenhouse gas emissions than it captures and even create oxygen depleted dead zones in the wide stretches of the ocean instead of blooming life back to the water. In spite of these dangers and despite the lack of consent among climate scientists and oceanographers about this effectiveness, one American businessman called George Russ, aka the Pacific Ocean Hacker, made it his mission to fertilize.
Can you guess the two words that gave me a hell of a lot of hesitation there when he introduced George Russ. American businessman. We don't have a good track record. That's a bit like saying German prison guard. I realize you can't. What am I if not an American businessman? I recognize the glass house from which I am whipping a stone. But goddamn, we got a real bad track record. And the fact that people are saying, wow, this could be disastrous, and this guy's saying, no, I know better. It reminds me of, Ocean Gate a little bit. Doesn't it? No, I know better. I'm in the ocean where laws don't apply to me, so you can't say nothing. Here's what to look out for. How does this guy become rich doing this thing? They'll answer it. They'll answer it. The question then to follow up with, once you have that, how does this guy make a fortune doing this thing that environmentalists are begging him not to do? The question then is he going to be more interested in making money or saving the planet? And my answer would be, if he was more interested in saving the planet, those environmentalists are people he would be working with rather than against. But let's find out. Maybe they team up.
As the ocean with rust. This solopreneur and self-proclaimed ocean pasture specialist was viciously attacked by governments.
No. That's as far as we could get. Self-proclaimed? Self-proclaimed. In other words, he's just some guy. He's just some guy. I'm going to tear into this dude even worse. Don't worry. But understand, I am still supportive of ideas like this. Like this. Despite the fact that I feel the way I feel about the specifics, I think this is the right track. How about that? I think this is the sort of thing that not only should we be doing, we're going to be required to be doing. We should have the government version of this heavily sponsored. But anyway, just want to make that clear. Self-proclaimed, and also, what else is he saying there? Let's listen to this.
Solopreneur and self-proclaimed ocean pasture specialist was viciously attacked by governments and scientists the world over.
There are some things that you can do that you don't have to understand all the details of to know they're wrong. Like, I don't need to know how brain chemistry works when you're drunk, and I don't need to know how to build a car to know you shouldn't drink and drive. There are other signs you can rely on. For example, if I can't find the keyhole to my car door, I've got my sign right there. If governments and scientists are screaming at you not to do something, and you're not a scientist, don't do it.
Even Greenpeace left Japanese whalers
alone. In fact, even if you are a scientist, wait until you have at least 50% consensus, for God's sake. It's all of our oceans for the principle of the thing alone.
For the first time to chase him down across the seas as if he was the devil incarnate. International law.
They might not have been wrong. I still like the overall goal.
Laws were passed, governments were mobilized, Greenpeace threatened to literally sink his ship, yet they couldn't stop him. He managed to do a large-scale ocean pasture restoration experiment back in 2012, and the results were staggering. We'll get back to that in a few moments, but first, let's take a look at how this whole idea started. Give me half a tanker of iron, and I'll give you the next ice age. That's the most famous quote from the late oceanographer John Martin of Moss Landing Marine Observatories in California. He said that in 1988, when he first proposed his iron hypothesis about a revolutionary new way of capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in the seabed. The original paper was published in 1990 and presented a hypothesis that explains the link between iron supply, phytoplankton production, and the sequestration of carbon in depth, which was responsible for the low carbon dioxide levels that led to the last ice age. In fact, I don't know if you realize this, but it's actually this form of phytoplankton carbon sequestration that later turned into the fossil fuels like gasoline and oil that we're burning today, not dinosaur remains like they've been teaching us in school. It's all based on something called the ocean's biological carbon pump. Here's a simplified step-by-step explanation of how it works. Before I get into that, have you ever Googled yourself to see how much private information is public online? I have, and it's seriously shocking. And why I signed up for Delete It from
Here we go.
Small animals, organic mixing, sunlight, carbon dioxide.
Now listen, I've got things to say on the experiment he ran itself. Let's just look at what is actually happening as best we can to try to understand it, at least to hear it out. I'll tell you, I've listened to this chunk of the video about 3 times. I don't fully get it, but I will explain my stance coming out the other side regardless. Maybe you will, though, and I'll appreciate the input.
Dioxide and nutrients. They convert CO2 into organic matter through photosynthesis, the same as plants do here on land. Then small animals called zooplankton eat the phytoplankton, transferring the organic carbon stored in phytoplankton into their bodies. The zooplankton are then eaten by larger marine life, such as fish, which in turn may be consumed by even larger predators and so on, transferring carbon up the food chain. When zooplankton and other marine organisms excrete waste or die, they release carbon-rich particles. These particles, along with the remains of phytoplankton and other organic matter, snow down toward the ocean floor. The marine snow slowly sinks through the water column, moving carbon from the surface of the ocean to the deep ocean, something called carbon export. As the marine snow sinks, it's broken down by bacteria and other decomposers. Some of the carbon is released back into the water as dissolved carbon dioxide and ultimately end up back at the atmosphere, but some of it is incorporated into the bodies of deep-sea organisms or buried in the sediment at the ocean floor. This traps the carbon away from the atmosphere for decades to millennia. Overall, the ocean's biological pump is one of the most important natural carbon sinks in the world.
So broad strokes, the problem is that of the things our planet's made of, one of the things is carbon, and we have too much of it in the wrong place. It's in the atmosphere. We need it elsewhere. All right, fair enough. One place we can put it, bottom of the ocean, where it's in fact it can be, according to this guy's hypothesis, part of the ecosystem. It can help rejuvenate a little bit. That's great. It's if I'm understanding that correctly, that's great. No complaints if it works, and maybe it does. I do definitely think we cannot trust this guy who stands to make a fortune if the world declares this is the thing we're all doing, to decide whether or not it works. It's those annoying scientists and governments that have to do that.
Estimated to suck up 5 to 12 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere each and every year. To put this in perspective, according to the UN, the total global annual carbon emissions amounted to 37 gigatons per year in 2021. So the ocean sucks up a significant portion of our carbon emissions, with land-based carbon sinks, trees, sucking up even more. But there's still an obvious excess in production, which is why we're here talking about carbon capture. It's estimated that we'd still need to either capture or reduce our annual carbon emissions by at least 1 gigaton every year to reach carbon neutrality and the global climate goals of the Paris Agreement. So if we could boost biological pumps to soak up 1 extra gigaton of carbon from the air, it would be smooth sailing from here on out. Or at least that's what the ocean fertilizer advocates tell us. The question is, could we really? And also, would we want to? To answer the first question,
To put it another way, their concern. Okay, that 100 gigatons of carbon after 100 years, what happens? What happens after we consistently, instead of dumping all of our carbon into the atmosphere, we dump it all into the ocean? And we say that short term, there's going to be some benefits to this. But what happens after long term takes effect, arrives, let's say? What happens after we get to the point where instead of a microscopic film of carbon along the surface of the seabed, of these particles, whatever they are, it's that thick, and a type of crab that used to feed on things by burrowing out of its holes, it just suffocates because its habitat has been smothered. I'm making this up, but that's the sort of thing we're talking about here. What are the long-term effects, and are we how close to 100% sure of the long-term effects are we going to be before we start doing this? The answer should be pretty damn close. The answer should be something like 99 point something percent sure that we know what's going to happen before we commit to doing the thing. And the kind of forces that push us to do major things like this before we're ready, that's what got us into this problem to begin with.
we need to understand why the plan is to fertilize the ocean with rust. I mean, rust isn't your typical fertilizer, right? Does the ocean have anemia or something? The explanation is actually very simple. Phytoplankton blooms work just like a big factory in the ocean. It needs a steady supply of nutrients just like a factory needs a steady supply chain. Like all plants, the main nutrients phytoplankton need to grow are carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Scientists used to believe that the limiting factor was always phosphorus since that's the hardest element to come by in the open ocean. There's a ton of carbon and nitrogen in our atmosphere that dissolves freely in the ocean. But it turns out that phytoplankton can't use the nitrogen as it is in the air. They need a special enzyme to fix the nitrogen, and that enzyme needs iron to work. So it turns out to be iron and not phosphorus or any other nutrient, which limits phytoplankton growth in the open seas. The good thing is that you need very little iron to make phytoplankton grow, since it's only a micronutrient, making it literally dirt cheap. But how much carbon could we capture even if we did fertilize the oceans with iron? That's where the debate starts heating up. The truth is, no one really knows. Even if we boost phytoplankton and absorb more carbon from the air, that doesn't guarantee that the carbon will end up sequestered in the sea floor. In the biological pump, phytoplankton enters the food chain, so most of the carbon ends up dissolved back in the oceans as CO2 and back into the atmosphere because sea creatures, like all animals, breathe oxygen and use it to turn their food into energy, water, and CO2. So in the end, only a small fraction of the phytoplankton biomass actually makes it to the deep ocean. You know, that carbon export we were talking about a minute ago. And no one has been able to accurately measure exactly how much that is, or even if the phytoplankton blooms after iron fertilization increased that carbon export. It's all still very theoretical. But still, the worst estimates based on the extent of iron deficient waters around the globe imply that this technique may be capable, at best, of sequestering 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide per year, which is precisely what we need to reach carbon neutrality. So what's the holdup? The concept of geoengineering the ocean through iron fertilization has been met with both excitement and concern. While the potential benefits of increased phytoplankton growth and carbon sequestration are evident, there are several dangers associated with the process. Besides phytoplankton, introducing iron to the ocean can encourage the growth of harmful algal blooms, which can release neurotoxins and harm marine life, as well as negatively impact human health and coastal economies. Altering nutrient balances in the ocean can disrupt delicate marine ecosystems, potentially leading to cascading effects of various species and habitats, none of which we're fully aware of and fully understand just yet. The long-term impacts of iron fertilization.
In other words, that thing I was talking about, the made-up crab. It's not that we should not explore this specific technique. We definitely should. In fact, evidence to that coming up quick here. We should look into this. We should be sponsoring government programs to look into this, or at least explain to us why it wouldn't work. But it's promising enough that, yes, this is something we should be, as a collective, pursuing in some manner, pursuing the truth of the technique. Will it save us? Will a little bit of it help, even if we don't do a lot? Are there areas of the ocean where we could do this, as opposed to areas where we shouldn't do it, and so on and so forth? But leaving it in letting business folks lead the charge is a mistake, because they will not do it properly. And in fact, what they will instead accomplish is spoiling the idea for all of us. They'll do it wrong. They'll do it harmfully. They will not help the environment. I know that's a kick in the teeth, but it's true. They through the pursuit of fortune, they will have to, basically, when you're trying to help the environment, the benefit of your actions is the help to the environment. And if you are pursuing it entirely as a business, in fact, forget that. If you're pursuing it as a business, you have to know that you will increase your profits by cutting in to the quality of your product, the quality of the output. And in an unregulated capitalist society like we currently live in, the amount of good you will end up doing will be the smallest amount you can get away with, including, even if it ends up being, instead of doing good, doing a lot of bad, because you're allowed to get away with it.
On the ocean and global climate are still not well understood either. Unintended consequences and side effects could emerge as the process is scaled up, making it difficult to predict and manage. Some scientists believe the effect could even be worse than the problem of methane-producing bacteria eating dead plankton, since methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. One important unintended consequence and a strong reason for pushback against this type of geoengineering is that even though phytoplankton produces oxygen through photosynthesis, phytoplankton blooms can actually produce oxygen-depleted dead zones in the ocean when they're eaten by oxygen-hungry zooplankton or other aquatic life forms. Some studies, such as the ones conducted by researchers at MIT, suggest that iron fertilization may not have a significant overall effect on carbon export, making it an ineffective method for carbon capture. Finally, there are many reasons why the real cost of carbon sequestration using carbon fertilization may be much higher than originally thought. Between offsets from unintended methane and nitrous oxide production to lower than expected carbon export, the actual cost could be as high as $457 per ton of CO2, putting it among the most expensive solutions on the market today. As you can see, the ocean is a complex system, and there's literally no way to know for certain what something like a global-scale iron fertilization project would do to the world. But it seems some people just don't care about risks and uncertainty, and that's the case with Russ George, an American businessman who dedicated his life to helping rid the world of excess carbon emissions, first by planting trees, then by fertilizing the ocean with rust, all while making some money on the side.
Wait a minute. All right, finish that sentence. Let me go ahead.
First by planting trees, then by fertilizing the ocean with rust, all while making some money on the side while selling carbon credits. You gotta let the enterprising businessman. He
dedicated his life? No, he did not. At most, he's dedicated his business to saving the environment, quote unquote. But really, he's just in the environment saving business. That's not the same as saving the environment. It's certainly not the same as dedicating your life to saving the environment. All while making some money on the side. All while making some money on the side by selling carbon credits. Here are the problems with carbon credits, and I'd like you to keep them in mind as we hear the last bit. We have two problems. Number one, we're past the point of neutrality being enough. That's gone. And we need to understand that. It doesn't mean that neutrality is worse than doing nothing. Certainly not. But when you are selling carbon credits as your business, what you end up with, nothing. Because the company, let's say we have a company who burns coal to make their money, and they pump carbon into the atmosphere, and then they pay a company, a carbon offset company, to do to plant trees, let's say, to capture that carbon and hold it in the form of a tree. You have two problems. That coal that was in the ground and would have been in the ground for our purposes basically forever. Now its carbon is being held in a tree, which may burn in a forest fire and once again release that carbon, or may yada 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 yada. You haven't really dealt with the problem. All you've accomplished is allowing that coal burning company to say, we're carbon neutral, when really all they've done is shifted their carbon around and stored it in a place that we have allowed them to say is just as good as if it was never taken out of the coal in the first place. But we know that's not true. Or at least we in almost all cases suspect that is not true. Similarly, or rather I should say in a similar vein, we don't regulate these people very well. We don't have the policing set up to make sure these people are sticking by what they say. For all we know, they could buy a carbon credit for 1 gigaton. I just want to say the word gigaton more because it's fun. All right, 1 ton. Let's just keep it simple of carbon. They purchase that. But then they use that purchase to justify 100 tons of carbon that they pump into the atmosphere. But they're simply lying. They're lying. And they know there's no one that's going to catch them. And if they do get caught, the fine they will pay is tiny in comparison to what they would have had to pay to offset the carbon. Basically, this is a way to make things boring enough that we don't pay very close attention. And so we let them get away with doing the same thing they've always been doing. Before, they could just lie to us and say that, no, it's not true. We're not hurting the environment. Now they're saying, okay, we were hurting the environment, but now we're not hurting the environment. See, we paid a very small amount of money for our purposes. We've made a new billionaire. We all got together and we made a new billionaire for you. There you go. See? It's all better now. Now, I realize your backyard is actually on fire, but the good news is we might plant a tree. This guy is setting up a carbon offset business with let me say this, barely tested technology, and he's the one that tested it. So it's in his interest to say, oh, it's going to save us all. It's going to save us all.
He's also probably the reason why this idea was satanized from the start. You see, Russ decided to make Martin's iron hypothesis and turn it into a cheap carbon credit goldmine. His idea was to sell companies carbon credits for fertilizing the ocean with rust, assuring them that the technique would successfully capture carbon while boosting the ocean's food chain and bringing about more fish to the ocean. But the problem is that this is an unproven technology, and a dangerous one at that. When Greenpeace caught on that the guy who sold the Vatican an imaginary forest was about to dump thousands of tons of rust in the Galapagos, one of the most important natural reserves in the world, they pointed all their guns at George Russ and to whoever they thought would be pursuing the idea. They even
God damn, that's interesting. I'd love to go into the story about the selling of the imaginary forest to the Vatican. That's hilarious. And by the way, another carbon offset scam, it sounds like. But let me jump through this real world test. Here it is in a nutshell. Greenpeace tried to stop him. He didn't stop. He did successfully dump a load of iron into the ocean. And the result was that he reported, I should say, that this guy reported no measurable harm. And the next year, the year that followed, was the second best salmon harvest that area had ever seen. Neat. Why am I skipping past that? Because we're at a half hour already. and there's almost no way to talk about it quickly. But it doesn't change anything that we went over. Let's talk about what you can do. So in short, in response to the Anti-Corporatist asking, what do you think of this video? I think it is great that a capitalist pig has taken an interest in this type of technology. I think he might be onto something. And I think it's a shame that this fella has become a mascot for it, because he's shady as hell. I would like to see our governments, and now when I say our, I mean the whole world. I want to see us all experimenting with this and things like it. You don't have to, you can do this in a lab. You don't have to take the kinds of risks this guy was taking. As a matter of fact, I would argue you don't have a right to take the kind of risks this guy was taking. Imagine if we tried to make the atom bomb, the Manhattan Project, a capitalist endeavor. And you have an idea of the kind of potential destruction we're talking about here. These are ecosystems where if they go down, that's the game. For a lot of human communities. But ultimately, it could start a chain reaction, the consequences of which are, they're more dire than I'm able to express properly. But so's doing nothing. So here we are. So how then? How do we proceed? It doesn't help to say, well, that's not the right answer, but also that's not the right answer. Well, we have to change the way we find the answer. Number one, we don't seem to have an issue, really, with convincing people that the problem's here. Why? Because it's tearing down houses. And all the folks that refuse to see Jesus when it comes to this, they gonna meet the Lord by their own hands. Because the global warming is here, and it's causing increasingly horrible problems. So, okay. What we need to do is eliminate the idea of carbon buyback programs, the carbon offset purchases. If you are in a country that does this, tell whoever represents you, you don't want that. You cannot pass off this responsibility. You cannot, number one, let the people who are poisoning us pretend like they are not poisoning us, because they are. We can't, and we certainly can't have a program like this when we refuse to regulate these folks at all, when we refuse to police these folks at all. When we trust their word is worth nothing. That's been demonstrated over and over again. In fact, they're liars. If you're a billionaire, you lie. It's that simple. If you're the CEO of a company, you lie. It is truly that simple. There's probably a better way to arrange society so that the leaders of industry don't lie dangerously and constantly But I don't know what that is, and I'm not going to waste your time trying to figure it out here. I'm just saying that we do not have a society set up in any country on this earth in this era where a carbon offset program is going to do good as opposed to harm. So, what you can do if you are interested in ideas like this, becoming the responsibility of the government or universities or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, things that we need, not being stolen and ruined by capitalists. Tell your government, tell your representatives, so let me try this again. Tell your government through your representatives that you do not want carbon offset programs to exist in your neck of the woods.